What is the most intelligent, yet brutal move in business you have ever heard of? One guy from Enron knew the company would tank, so he intentionally cheated on his wife with a stripper, got caught, then the divorce court made him liquidate all his assets so he could sell his $200 million worth of stock, which apparently let him sell without being charged for insider trading or something. This might be my favorite one of all. Somebody else might be able to source it. I couldn't find one looking quickly. I think that Henry Ford pretended to be retiring and leaving Ford to his incompetent son so that everyone would sell their shares. He then bought all the shares to regain full control of his company. Ford was a freaking genius. The way Uber just fights everything. Need a medallion to pick people up from the airport? Nonsense. Do it anyway and we'll cover your legal battle and fines. You don't want us Portland? We'll launch in a small town in Washington nearby and fight your city council until we are allowed back in. People always talk about how innovative they are, which is largely true, but I think what gets overlooked is their willingness to fight legal barriers rather than simply go around them. Well, frick taxis, that's why. I watched the founder a little while ago. Ray Kroc basically stole everything from the actual creators of McDonald's and then royally fricked them over. Smart but so brutal. Hollister figured out that their customers spend more when parents aren't hanging around them. That's why it's so dark in the stores and why the music is so loud. They also started placing them near benches and at least 3 doors or fewer away from Starbucks to keep parents out of the store even longer. The Corner. There's a great story in the book Business Adventures about the last great corner by the owner of the Piggly Wiggly. It's too long to relate in detail and he eventually got screwed because Wall Saint changed the rules after they lost, but it was still brilliant. A corner works like this. You own a company. Investors decide your company looks like it's not doing well, so they short the stock. To short a stock, you borrow it from a broker and sell it immediately. You hope that the price of the stock goes down, so when the broker you borrowed it from wants it back you can buy it much cheaper and keep the difference. Now, if you own a company, it's very bad if a lot of people are shorting your stock. Back in the day the short sellers would even start spreading rumors that your company was doing poorly to try and create a panic and force your stock price down. Not very nice. In comes the Corner. The main owner-founder of the company finds their stock is being shorted, so they start buying it. They buy as much of it as they can. Ideally they buy all of their company's stock that is available for sale on the open market. Then, when the loans that short sellers took out come due, they have no choice but to buy the stock from the company owner who can gouge them with whatever price they want. The owner has forced the short sellers into a corner, or cornered the market, as they say. The regulations changed long ago so this isn't really possible anymore, but still pretty brilliant in its time. Clarence Saunders. Crazy brilliant guy, also stubborn to a fault, lost his fortune in the end. Crassus made the first organized firefighting team. He would wait to get word that a house in Rome had caught fire, rush there with his firefighters and find the owner. He would then offer to buy the house for way less than it was worth. You see, Crassus was only interested in fighting fires when it was his house on fire. If you didn't sell to him, he would happily stand there and watch it burn and start to spread to other houses. Then your neighbors would come out terrified that their house would be next, and he'd again start making offers for way less than the real value. Sometimes people sold right away, sometimes they just lost everything. But usually, Crassus got his hands on at least one new property each time there was a fire. This is partly how Crassus ended up owning a huge portion of the land in Rome, and got his name in the running for wealthiest person who has ever lived. And that ruthless business cunning didn't translate to battlefield prowess. He led his troops into the embarrassing Battle of Carrhae against the Parthians. The best heavy infantry in the world was woefully mismanaged and pit against mounted archers that ran circles around them and pelted them with arrows. For his trouble both he and his son lost their lives, and then their heads. Steve Jobs was elected CEO of Apple after their share value plummeted. That was caused by Steve Jobs selling all his shares. Well, he ended up owning a huge chunk of Disney, so Apple was just a side project. The story of how small-time soap company got the better of giants like P&G. Unilever etc. Liquid soap has pretty much replaced solid soap in many different settings. Many consumers around the world use liquid soap and prefer it very much over its solid counterpart. Do you know who came up with the first commercially scalable version of it? No, it wasn't Colgate-Palmolive or even P&G. It was a small company, in comparison, called Minnetonka Corporation. The problem: although Minnetonka had a game-changing product in their hands, there was a big problem of market share involved. How could a small-time firm compete against the giants of soap business who would invariably copy the product and then use their deep pockets to control the market? The complication was that nothing of the soap or its production was patentable. Way back in 1865, a certain William Shepard had patented the discovery that by the addition of comparatively small quantities of common soap to a large quantity of spirits of ammonia or hartshorn, the soap is thickened to the consistency of molasses, aka the liquid soap. Minnetonka had simply made it usable on the household level. The trick: Minnetonka understood that they couldn't stop the other companies from copying their slick product, but could prevent them from actually getting their copy soaps to market. Management realized one simple thing: one of the key aspects of the liquid experience was the dispensing of the soap itself through the bottle's pump. The patent for the pump was closely held, and there were only two manufacturers for the device. Robert R. Taylor, the owner of the company, shrewdly purchased 100 million small bottle hand pumps from the only two US manufacturers that made them, so that any competitors wouldn't be able to buy any for 1 year, enough time for him to establish the brand name. And this meant that even though Unilever and Procter & Gamble were able to very quickly replicate what liquid soap was about, Minnetonka had a 1-year lead of launching products on the market for consumers because they were the only ones with pumps. The effect: Robert R. Taylor's trick worked wonders. In 6 months, he sold $25 million worth of soft soap, the name he gave to his product. The package made it very easy to spot on store shelves when nearly all other soaps were in bar form. He sold his Village Bath and Soft Soap brands to Colgate-Palmolive Company in 1987 for $61 million. 2 years later, Unilever plc bought his Minnetonka Corporation, which included the Calvin Klein fragrances, for a whopping $376 million. Monster Cable did most of the engineering and design work on Beats headphones while negotiating a final contract, but before it was signed, Beats kept making modifications to the contract and Monster kept working and idiotically turning over design specs plans and accepting nominal payments for engineering work. In the end, Beats paid very little for the design that untimely made them billions, while Monster Cable got a few $100K for their work. They never got a contract signed. The people at Beats knew nothing about audio design or manufacturing, but they knew business. That isn't intelligent. That is basically just fraud. This is an example from college football, but I think it counts since most states' most highly paid public employee is a football coach, meaning it's big business. In late October of 2007, the Georgia Bulldogs squared off against their bitterest division rivals, Florida. This is a relationship so acrimonious that the game is never played on either team's home field, choosing instead the neutral ground of the Jacksonville Jaguars Stadium. Number 9 Florida was coming off of a 2006 national championship win. By contrast, number 20 Georgia had barely broken even within the conference the previous season. On top of that, Florida had had the better of Georgia in 15 of the last 17 matchups. Both teams had suffered exactly 2 conference losses, and so had both South Carolina and Tennessee, who would also play each other that day, making it all but a do-or-die day for all 4 teams, essentially tied for the lead of the SEC East. Game time rolls around and Florida wins the toss. They elect to receive. Following a 15-yard drive, Georgia forces a fumble. Now Sean Moreno then powers his way through 39 yards over the course of 9 consecutive rushing plays into the end zone. But here's where it gets interesting. Mark Richt, who has a well-established reputation as one of the cleanest and least flamboyant coaches in college football, a Boy Scout if you will, sends the entire Georgia team out onto the field in a pan celebration, intentionally incurring a double unsportsmanlike conduct penalty. But it totally worked. Despite the psychological edge that Florida had, a motivated Georgia team went on to win a scrappy 42-30 victory over the Gators, in which Sean Moreno ran for a total of 188 yards, and the Georgia defense managed 6 sacks against Tim Tebow. But that's not the brutal business move. That came later as a hypothetical. In the days following the game, Steve Spurrier, the former, quite successful, head coach of Florida and general evil genius who had given the Dogs so much grief in this particular matchup in previous years, was asked how he would have reacted to that situation had he still been at Florida when it happened. I assume the reporter was looking for something along the lines of, well, I would have used it to get my boys fired up instead, without missing a beat. Spurrier replies that he would have sent his third string out to start a fight, since NCAA rules call for the ejection of any player that leaves the bench for a fight. He would have sacrificed his third string to take out Rich's first, and really probably most of the second and third too. Cold, calculating, brutal, but damn it, smart as heck. There's a reason he's hat in butt Spurrier, haha. Not brutal, but extremely intelligent. The CEO of a company I used to work for bought land in the 1980s and built an office building on it. Since then he has been leasing the building land back to the company, and their corporate headquarters run out of that office. He's basically been paying himself. It's genius. In the 1930s, the Metropolitan Railway Company bought a load of fields in what was then rural outer London, built tube stations, and then sold the land all around them for houses. Essentially, the land around the station was only valuable because of the railway leading into central London. I would love if someone can help me remember the specifics of this story. Basically, business A was selling widgets and in fierce competition with B selling the same thing, but they each kept reducing prices, trying to knock the other out of business. Finally, B's pricing got so low that it could put A out of business if they offered the same pricing. However, A knew that the pricing wasn't sustainable for B, so it secretly started buying massive quantities of widgets from B. B finally folded from the unsustainable pricing. Ray Kroc and the growth of McDonald's. McDonald's was started as a small diner in California by two brothers from the Midwest, the McDonald brothers. The restaurant's differentiating factor was the speed food was made after ordered. While a regular diner made you wait a while to order and get food, McDonald's original goal was to get you food within a minute of ordering. Ray Kroc, a traveling salesman at the time, thought this was a brilliant creation and signed a contract with the brothers, allowing him to franchise the company out. However, he constantly got into fights with the brothers about who he could franchise out to and the quality of food used in each restaurant. Ray felt the brothers were holding back the company's potential. Eventually, he ended up creating a separate real estate company that bought up individual plots of land, and Ray would only allow McDonald's to franchise out to people who leased that land. Effectively, he owned the company. He ended up buying the McDonald's brothers out of the company for around $2 million. In the agreement, he told them he'd give them 1% of year-end company earnings in perpetuity, and he told them they could keep the original store they owned. He ended up reneging on the earnings deal, forced the brothers to change the name of their store, and then opened up a McDonald's of his own across the street from the brothers, driving them out of business. Oh, and he also cheated on his wife with the wife of a franchisee. The man was ruthless. I always liked the story of Kerry Packer selling Channel 9 to Alan Bond. Packer knew Bond was desperate to own a TV station. He also knew Bond didn't have the money to run it. He sold it for over $1 Australian billion in 1987 and bought it back a few years later when Bond was going under at a heavily discounted price. The plans to buy it back at a discounted price were allegedly put in place before it was ever sold. I lived in WA during the WA Inc. years. The place was a constant party. That was an enamoring piece of work from Packer. My girlfriend's dad owns a towing company. In the beginning, there was lots of competition, but there was one other company that was stealing away a lot of his business. So he paid people to park their cars in front of the gates to the rival towing company so that they couldn't get out. He then had the people call up his company to move this. People would see his company towing the car, and his rival was unable to get any business, so after a while they shut down. I'm 100% sure this was illegal on many accounts, but he never got caught, so good for him. The biggest towing company in our town started out by having free donuts and coffee in their air-conditioned lobby to get cops to hang out there, then follow the cops to accidents so their tow truck would be there before you could call one. McDonald's a few years ago, or at least some firm, they got a hold of a ton of seeds to a flower that is rare in California and planted a giant McDonald's sign on a hill on the side of a highway. No one was told and no one noticed anything until a giant M grew. The flower was so rare it was illegal to pick them or cut them, so McDonald's got free advertising. Ford sued the US government for bombing his factories in Germany. A known anti-Semite, Henry Ford contributed to the German war machine in World War II. It wasn't just Ford. A bunch of corporations skirted the rules around doing business with Nazi Germany and then got compensation from the US government. Fricked up crap. The guy who invented liquid soap, soft soap, went to the only manufacturers of pump bottles in the country and placed an order big enough to backlog them for years. Even if his competitors tried selling an imitation product, there was nothing for them to put it in. The way Bill Gates got a contract for DOS even before he actually had it, then bought an OS off of someone else relatively cheap and changed it a little, then resold it. Decades ago, back before Vegas is as expansive as it is today, a family friend bought a plot of land out in the desert. Then he just sat and waited for the city of Vegas to come knocking on his door wanting to buy it from him. He retired early. That doesn't sound brutal, it sounds like property investment 101. Not in business, but history. So, in the 1860s, the West basically conquered China. At that time, China was a fairly peaceful country, with good morals and ethics. They then sold some pieces of China to the English. The English fell in love with China, so they wanted to do more trade with China. China said no, so the English basically got everyone high on opium. Those that weren't high rebelled and were subsequently defeated by steamboats with cannons, brutally, by the English and the French, who also fell in love with China. They forced China to do trade with them, and if a single English or French citizen was harmed, the peaceful and quiet towns of China would be crushed by the cannons of the West. But wait, the story hasn't ended yet. Way in the far, distant lands of Japan, the emperor saw all this. BTW, he was basically a puppet of the samurai, the nobles, etc. So the West go to trade with Japan, and the same thing happens. Japan limits the trade, the West gets upset and prepares to go to war. The nobles see this and see what happened in China, and they're basically like, you know what, frick this emperor, we are the Japanese. So they overthrow the emperor. Very quietly, they then invite the West into their country. What you're probably thinking, and you're right, but here comes the best part. The new Japanese emperor, who is actually in control this time, lets the West do whatever the frick they want. The West is basically like great. Someone who understands business and proceed to get profits by showing the Japanese everything they want and selling them anything they want. Within a few decades, the Japs had learned everything their Western counterparts could show them. So they politely and respectfully turn to the West and say, now we know what you know. Now we will go out in search of trade and conquest. Now we will turn our guns on the innocent should a Japanese citizen be harmed. And they did just that. The West played themselves hard, and they never got over it. For the Japanese turned out to be the best students in the history of the world. Explains why Japan became much more powerful than its neighbors. Back in the day when everyone used the yellow pages, I remember reading about a guy in a small town where there was only 2 pizza places. His competition took out a big nice ad in the yellow pages. It was way bigger than his. So he ran an ad in the newspaper. It said something like, offer expires in 1 year. Get 1 free large pizza with his competition's torn out yellow page ad. Soon there wasn't a yellow page book in town with his competition's ad in it. Good lord, that is genius. Having grown up in the days of opening the phone book, looking up the Piazza Place's number and so on, this must have worked well. In professional hockey, NHL, back in the early 50s there was a player named John Beliveau that the Montreal Canadiens general manager really wanted on his team. So, He signed Beliveau, who was a generational talent caliber player, to a contract stating that, were Beliveau to ever turn pro, the Canadians would own his rights and Beliveau would have to play for them. However, Beliveau didn't have much intention of going pro. He was already getting paid handsomely in the league he was playing in due to being its best player. So, the Canadiens GM simply bought the league that Beliveau was playing in, converted it to a professional league, which made Beliveau a pro athlete, and thus forcing him to report to Canadiens training camp the following year. He then became one of the Canadiens and pro hockey's all-time greatest players and won 10 Stanley Cups as a player, followed by 7 as a team executive. I'd say that's a pretty brilliant move, buying an entire league just to get one player to play for you. I've got to be vague here. I know an executive who was tasked with shopping a multi-million-dollar plus business around to investment bankers. The exec sabotaged all potential deals with outsiders innocently, and secretly backdoored friends from business school into the deal. The exec took a few plus mil on the back end after the sale went through, for wrecking all outside deals. Range Rover had a new model out, had a sample parked right outside of Harrods, with all sorts of things written in the windows, calling out the driver for being a cheater or something. People clicked pictures of that and posted it on social media, so that generated a buzz. More like good marketing rather than brutal business move. Guy has a farm game, is talking to Zynga about selling his farm game. While he's waiting for his meeting, they stage a meeting nearby where they're talking loudly so he can overhear about all the new ways to make money from the farm games. He backs out of the deal thinking he's selling too cheap. Zynga goes forward with their own knockoff version of the farm game and don't have to pay the guy because he's the one that backed out of the deal. Zynga has quite a history of doing this. Shorting the housing market before 2008, which means that you bet against the world economy. I believe they made a movie about it. The Big Short is the movie. I quite enjoyed it. Every flight you're on is overbooked because the airline knows that a certain number of people for each flight will likely not show, so they make a bigger profit. And if for some reason most people show up for the flight, they'll ask a volunteer to take the next, and they'll refund their ticket maybe and usually likely because they're still not losing any money. They might even give more. Unfortunately, if no one decides to volunteer, the airline reserves the right to leave anyone off the flight. A lot more logistics to this, but it all boils down to the fact the airlines aren't regulated. However, it's a lot less wasteful than having a crap ton of empty seats on a plane. Not really brutal, but Nintendo is struggling to keep up with demand because their Switches need a chip that Apple makes, and there is a supply problem with that. It's the same one they put in their iPhones. Of course, 2 days or so after this information releases, Apple makes the HomePod, a Series speaker that uses the same chip. Screw Apple Mayo. I don't think Apple makes any chips. Currently, PNW company Hagen Foods wanted to expand. In a bid to consolidate, Albertsons was trying to buy Safeway to comply with the FTC, which was worried about Albertsons having an effective monopoly on food in those markets. Albertsons had to sell off some of their stores, so Hagen bought them, kinda. In a lawsuit, Hagen claimed that Albertsons wasn't holding up their end of the sale. In the process, Hagen filed for bankruptcy, at which time Albertsons bought most of Hagen's stores, including the ones it was forced to sell to comply with the FTC's anti-monopoly conditions of the Safeway merger, at bankruptcy prices. This left Albertsons with effective monopolies in the areas that the FTC was concerned with, and many of Hagen's stores to boot. The lottery scratch ticket system is not cool. They can continue selling losing tickets even if all major advertised prizes are claimed. Also, I think the lottery was originally intended to support the school system but ended in a bait and switch. Obadiah Stane hired some Al-Qaeda wanabes to kill his partner's son so he could gain control of the company, but when that son invented a new form of energy to escape, Stane stole the technology. The Dawn Raid of Malaysia. Basically Malaysia buying back lands owned by the British from the previous colonization back in 1981. Sadly, I can't find any Wikipedia link on it. Vail Resort swooped in when Park City failed to renew their national forest contract. This rendered Park City's assets worthless. Lifts that went up a mountain they didn't have the lease to ski on, basically forcing them to be acquired by Vail. Not sure if this counts, But I read a comment on Reddit the other day that some drug dealers intentionally make some of their product lethal in order to give their users the impression that their drugs are stronger than their competitors. Really surprised that the Rothschilds aren't mentioned in here. Business tactic, fund both sides of a war, economy crashes, buy central bank, control economy. Anything Nintendo did to Argonaut games. Also Sega stealing the idea for Sonic Riders from someone who pitched the idea. It was one of the robber barons, but I can't remember which one. He wrote a check for $100 million as collateral for a loan to start a new company. He asked the bank to just hold on to the check as collateral and not cash it. That company issued $200 million of stock and used $100 million of it to buy a company that produced something, steel. With the other $100 million he paid off the original loan and got his check back uncashed, creating $100 million out of thin air. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.